Morishima, and I'm the Assistant Staff Director to the Office of Program Research. We're the nonpartisan research staff for the Washington State House of Representatives. I've been asked to come in and give a little talk today about our office and our internship program, and we are accepting applications for that program now. And I was going to talk to you a little bit about our office and what our office does and how our program works. And that's not only in case you're interested in our program, but we also, we hire new MPA graduates straight out of Evans a lot. And we also hire people who are more experienced who have MPAs. So even if you're not interested in our program now, it might be useful to you to learn about our office and what we do 5 years from now, if you happen to be interested in coming down to Olympia. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a very informal discussion. So please feel free to interrupt me with questions or commentary, and your questions don't need to be limited to my office or the program, but if you have questions about the legislature and legislative process, I just finished my 25th legislative session on Thursday, so I do have some facility with legislative process. So if you want to ask questions about that, I'm happy to answer any questions I can about that as well. So with that, why don't I get started really quickly and just tell you a little bit about our office and what we do. As I mentioned earlier, we're the Office of Program Research. I call us the just the facts folks. So our job is not to tell members what they should or shouldn't do. We don't tell them if their ideas are good ideas or bad ideas. Rather, our job is to give them the unbiased information they need to make the important decisions that they have to make. And then once they make those decisions, even if they, fly in the face of the research that we provided them, we help them implement those decisions by drafting bills, drafting amendments, and that sort of thing. So we have 3 categories of employees working in my office, and our office has a permanent staff of around 70 full-time staffers, and about a third of us are fiscal analysts. So those are generally people with MPAs, like you'll be earning shortly. And about a third of us are what we call research analysts, and this is sort of like the policy side of our shop. And those are also people with MPAs. And about a third of us are attorneys. And the office staff director and I just happen to be attorneys, but our office is only about a third attorneys. We provide many services for the House of Representatives, including policy analysis, fiscal analysis, legal research. We do a lot of drafting. So about 75% of the bills that get introduced in the House originate in my office. And about 100% of the subsequent legislative documents like amendments and substitute bills and that sort of thing originate with my office as well. We provide a lot of committee administrative assistance. So we help legislators develop their agendas. We publish them and implement those agendas once they've been published. We give presentations in front of the standing committees of the House. I don't know if you've ever watched a legislative hearing, but there's some kind of boring people who give a talk on what the bill does and answer questions. Well, those boring folks are us. So we give that sort of unbiased information to the committee and what the bill does, and they can ask us technical questions about what the bill does. I usually tell them that my job is kind of like being a legal translator. So I translate things in and out of legalese for members. So I do research, and then I explain what bills do. And when members tell me in sort of lay terms what they want to get done, I translate that into bill language. And our research analysts and attorneys do the same job. So it's just that their background and focus are different. So so a lawyer in my office will have obviously a legal background, and an MPA student, an MPA person would have a policy background, but the services we provide to the members are the same. So our work is divided into two seasons. The legislative session, which just ended, and the interim. During the legislative session, this job is fairly demanding. Oh, it looks like there's another question. I'm sorry, Sam, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Sorry, I'll be brief, but you've mentioned a couple times in your presentation so far that the role of the office is really to provide as unbiased as information as possible to legislators. I'm curious, like, what kinds of processes or tools does your office use to talk about or address things like inherent bias and biases that might arise throughout your guys' research and whatnot. It's just curious, like if what kind of things go on with that.
Well, I often tell people that I think that it's impossible not to have any bias whatsoever, right? I mean, I think that having no bias is a form of bias. And I think our office bias is that we want members to have the facts necessary to do the work that we do. And in fact, as far as inherent bias goes, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but I do think that part of our job is, if we're informing a member about research that a third party did, our job is to identify any biases that may be associated with that research, and to try to provide both the strengths and the weaknesses of the information that's being presented to them. So our office, as I mentioned, is very seasonal. During the session, these jobs are very demanding. I don't think I worked a week that was less than 70 hours this last session, and frequently quite a few more hours than that. During the interim, though, our hours are more flexible. The House of Representatives allows us to work a 35-hour work week during the interim. There's some telecommuting options. We can compress our work weeks. It's very manageable workload for most of the interim until around November, when things start ramping up in November. So it's kind of nice. You get sort of a manageable, busy workload, but then you also get the excitement and the adrenaline of doing a really demanding job during the session. So I've always found it to be a very nice mixture of those things. Our office culture is very collaborative. We have a very flat organizational structure. There's a staff director. Her name is Jill Reinmuth, and myself, I'm her deputy. And then other than that, everybody else in the office is flat. So people aren't competing for promotions and trying to make themselves look better at the expense of their co-workers. A colleague of mine likes to say, we work really hard to try to make each other look good, not to make ourselves look good. And that's a very unique culture, I think, especially for attorneys, I think. And then, we work directly with legislators, so there's no bureaucracy between us and the legislators. So they approach us directly with projects. We obviously work with both Democrats and Republicans across the entire political spectrum. That nonpartisan aspect of our job is very important to us. So not only do I have to put my personal feelings aside when I do a project for a legislator, but I also have to make sure that they can trust that the work that I'm doing for them is that I'm not, sabotaging them or favoring one side or the other. So for that reason, the people who work in my office avoid overt political activities. So for example, I don't make political contributions or do campaign work. I don't write letters to the editor. If you were to look at my Facebook page, you would see pictures of my dog and my wife's horse on it. I try to be as much of a cipher as I can to the members, so that if they see my public-facing persona, and I don't really have that much of a public-facing persona, but if they were to see that, they wouldn't be able to tell from what I have which side of the aisle I may favor or disfavor. So let me talk about our internship program really quickly, and I'll open it up to questions. So we've had a graduate internship program since the early 1970s, I believe. And so I was alive then, but I was a little kid. But the internship consists of two parts. There's a summer portion and a winter portion. And an intern who works, if an intern is selected for our program, they would be committing to both that summer portion and that linked winter portion. So the summer portion is a training period. So during the summer, we train you to do the job, basically. So we have a very extensive training program in my office. Very few people come to work for us that have any experience doing this job. It's a very unique job, and it's unusual to find people who have experience doing this. So we have to not only train interns, but we also have to train new staff to do this job as well. So the training program consists of everything from legislative ethics to how to draft a bill to how to make a presentation, all the skills that you would need to do the job you would learn in the summer. The summer is capped off by a mock hearing. So the interns draft a fake bill and give a bill presentation in front of a fake legislative committee made up of OPR staff, and just sort of put you through your paces and put all of the information you learned in the summer in a practical context where you can actually practice using it in a safe environment before you come back and have to do it for real. During the summer, the interns also participate in research projects for the staff, and also I try to arrange what I call meet and greets with various Olympia officials, just so you can see what other kinds of employment opportunities are available down here in Olympia. I know, it's kind of, when I grew up in Seattle myself, and I think that, Olympia was a big mystery to me before I started working here. So I always think it's kind of nice for people to see the kinds of careers that are available down here. Examples of some of the summer activities we've arranged in the past include touring the TVW studios, and TVW is like Washington's version of C-SPAN. So you get to tour this working TV studio. That's kind of fun. We've also managed to arrange in the past a guided tour of the Supreme Court given by one of the justices. So that is actually an amazing opportunity. So those are just some of the outside of the office field trip type activities we try to arrange. So after the summer portion is done, the interns come back and work for us during the winter quarter, the portion of winter quarter that overlaps with the session. So you would come on the first day of instruction winter quarter and leave on the last day of instruction winter quarter. And during that part, that's where the rubber hits the road. That's actually, I think, the most fun part of the internship. You actually get to do the exact same job that any one of our professional staff gets to do. So you get to staff bills, you get to give presentations in front of committees, you get to meet legislators and interact with them, meet with lobbyists and other stakeholders and interact with them. The only difference between what an intern does and what somebody like me does is that the interns are supervised the entire time. So I assign experienced staff to supervise interns on each bill that they're assigned. And the other difference is I try to make sure that the interns' hours are more reasonable. I think I want the interns' hours to average 40 to 45 hours a week, not the 70 to 100 hours a week that the rest of us are working. So I try to be very conscious of that. The internship is paid. The compensation right now is around $3,200 a month. I say right now because I think it's going to go up when state employees get a COLA. I think it'll go up. It won't go down, but it might go up. Both parts of the internship are paid. We also hire 2 legal interns in addition to the 1 public affairs intern. We hire 2 legal interns, and those are law students. And UW Law School won't allow me to pay them, the illegal interns, for the extra, because they're getting credit for the winter portion, so they're not allowed to get paid. But the public affairs intern is paid for both portions. And I think that's all I have to mention about the internship program. So I just thought it might be nice to open it up to questions, and if you have any questions at all, not just about my office, but anything about working in Olympia or the legislature or anything that you are dying to know. I also know a lot about Star Trek, so if you want to ask me Star Trek questions, that's also okay. Peter?
This is admittedly a Star Trek related question, so it may sound a little ridiculous. The question I am wondering is, do you think that there are any significant human populations outside of the United Federation of Planets? Because it does seem a little odd that all the humans in Star Trek are willing to live under a single government, considering humanity's massive diversity.
Well, not to get too nerdy, but there are, of course, I'm sure you know, populations of humans who have decided not to live under Federation rule. The Maquis, for example, are a group of people who separated from the Federation. So I would imagine that, yes, there are probably human populations outside of the Federation.
Yeah, it's just the Maquis are very specific circumstances. Just thought I'd lighten things up before we get into.
Nice, I like it.
Second point, and this may be a little odd. Be working in this position, do you feel, especially if say you're not going to law school after this, do you feel that there's still a high value for this office? Because I'm a bit concerned that this might be a very lawyer-heavy position.
Well, that's a really good question, and I would say I don't. We as I mentioned, we're only about 1/3 attorneys, so about 2/3 of the people we hire are not lawyers. So I don't think that not wanting to go to law school is a detriment to your potential career path with our office. What I do think, though, is that the non-lawyers in our office do have to be comfortable with reading and analyzing laws and writing laws, because the non-attorneys in my office draft bills and draft amendments, and of course we train people how to do that. But you have to be comfortable with sort of stepping outside your comfort zone a little bit and learning how to read and analyze bills and learning how to identify legal issues. We don't require the MPAs in my office to do legal research, but it's helpful if they can identify a legal issue so that they can then pass that along to one of the attorney colleagues in the office for analysis. So I would say that not wanting to go to law school is not a problem, but having some comfort level with analyzing and reading laws and understanding the structures of government and 3 branches of government, et cetera, which I know you learn a lot about that in MPA school too. That is probably a necessary component to working here.
Okay, I have some experience with that. I just wanted to make sure that not going to law school wasn't a deal breaker.
No, definitely not. Otherwise, we would just hire 3 legal interns and not bother with a public affairs intern. So we want our office to have a good mixture of different perspectives, and we want our office to be have a good mix of professional backgrounds. We've found that diversity of academic background has been really good for our office. So that's actually a plus to working for us, not a minus.
Okay.
Kylie, am I pronouncing your name right? Do you have
Yes. Yeah, I was curious, and maybe outside of the internship program and more towards the staff, if you all work across like all different areas of policy, or if there's like specific specialties that you all work on.
That's an excellent question. So we are typically assigned to a particular committee. So for example, I am assigned to the healthcare committee. So I do mostly health professions regulation and private insurance. That's my specialty area in the office. But the great thing about working at OPR is that we fill all vacancies internally before we recruit externally. So if, for example, I've worked on a bunch of different committees, but where I really started in the office was doing criminal law, and I got tired of that after about 6 years, and I switched to healthcare. So, which, yeah, it's very, very disparate subject matter. So yeah, we do specialize, but there is opportunity to move around. So if somebody it feels like they're stagnating, they can always move to a different subject. One of the great things about working for the legislature, and one of the reasons why I've managed to stay in this career for so long, is that it's very hard to get bored. There's always something new. You're always learning. That's the great part about this job, is there's always something new to learn about, or some new wrinkle that you've never experienced before. Sam, it looks like you're next.
Yeah, thank you. This is more just a internship logistics question, and you kind of touched on this earlier, but is everything done in person, or is telecommuting an option that's available at sometimes? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a little bit of a difficult question, because I don't know what our office is going to look like going forward. I mean, we're all obviously in a very weird transitional period right now. But in a typical year prior to the pandemic, our entire program was in person. So the summer was in person and the winter was in person. Usually during the summer, the interns would commute from Seattle, and during the winter, they would usually rent a room. There's like a little cottage industry in Olympia where people rent rooms out for session. And so typically people would rent one of those rooms and move down here for session. So I can tell you that I think that the 2023 legislative session will likely be in person. So I think that part of the program will likely be entirely in person, unless we have another, pandemic type lockdown, in which case we'll be remote again. And the summer part is a little harder for me to answer right now, because I don't know what we're facing going forward. Right now, my office, we just finished session, which was all remote, and the House is trying to transition back to in-person operations. And I don't know how fast that's going to happen. Right now, they're still allowing us to telecommute. Like I'm sitting in my home office talking to you right now. But I think by the late fall at the latest, we'll be back to in-person operations again, assuming that that COVID cooperates with us. But the one thing I can tell you is that I will give the interns the same telecommuting options as a regular staffer would have. And so if we have the option to be remote during the summer, the interns will have that option. And if we are all have to be back in the office during the summer, the interns, of course, will have to abide by House of Representatives policies, because you will be a House of Representatives employee. And so I apologize for not knowing what we're doing yet, but that decision is above my pay grade. So I don't know where the House is going with that yet, but I will probably know, in plenty of time before the summer begins.
Awesome, thank you. If I could just ask one really
Of
brief
course,
follow-up
yeah, please
question.
do.
Is there, you mentioned that during the summer, typically interns have commuted from where they're living, which, as you mentioned, typically Seattle. I'm assuming they might come from a lot of other places as well. Is there a travel stipend available or subsidy available in addition to the normal wages that you were discussing?
There is not. There traditionally has not been a travel stipend. If we are remote, though, the House of Representatives does issue computer equipment, so you'll get a laptop and other kinds of equipment to help you remote in. But typically the House has not provided a travel reimbursement. The exception to that is for the legal interns. So for the winter portion, as I mentioned, I'm prohibited from paying the legal interns. So in lieu of the salary, they get a travel reimbursement, or they get reasonable rental expenses in lieu of salary.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure. Neil, did you have a question?
Yes, thanks, Jim, for taking the time to talk to us. My question was about the nonpartisan aspect, and I'm sure you kind of get this kind of question a lot. One example is there's some quite bad laws being passed in other states, right? There's this kind of transphobic laws in Florida. Texas has its own issues. I'm sure other people kind of have reservations of maybe being, kind of some of the writers of those bills, or assisting, the state Senate or House with drafting those bills. Could you kind of talk a bit about that kind of risk, maybe how you deal with that, and also maybe some of the benefits of having this kind of nonpartisan aspect, and maybe why you see that being very important?
That's a really good question, Neil, and that is something that a lot of our employees struggle with. The one thing I can say specific to, I'll talk about that specific to the internship program first, and then I'll talk about in general how people in my office deal with that sort of thing. Regarding the internship, it's unlikely that I will ever assign an intern to a bill like that. If there were to be a bill like that, it's unlikely I would assign an intern to a bill like that. I try to avoid really controversial hot button issues where the interns can get into very difficult situations with legislators. It's not that I don't trust the interns or their abilities, but I think it's a little unfair for me to throw them into a very complicated, but could be a very controversial workspace without having experience under their belts. So we usually wouldn't assign people to those kinds of bills. Regarding my office, I've worked for the House of Representatives under Republican control. I've worked here during a tie when it's been a 49-49 tie, and I've worked obviously currently when I'm working under the Democrats. And so I have a lot of experience working on bills that I have very strong personal opinions on. I draft bills for both Democrats and Republicans on a variety of subjects on both sides of the issue and both sides of the debates. I think the people in my office, we view ourselves as an important part of the democratic process. I feel like the democratic process is in charge of what we as a state do and what we don't do, of course, within the bounds of the state and federal constitutions. And so I don't usually have a problem personally working on things I disagree with, even if I have extremely strong opinions about them, which I frequently do. I mean, the people who work at my office were interested in policy, so of course we have our own opinions on things. But I view the political process and democracy as being so important that, to me, my role in helping the democratic process, and this sounds really corny, I apologize, but my view of participating and helping in that democratic process, to me, outweighs the distaste I may feel about working on a bill that I have strong feelings about. And my experience working in the Washington legislature, and obviously other state legislatures may be different, but my experience working in Washington has been that a lot of the really extreme ideas on both ends of the spectrum kind of don't go anywhere. Right, like the legislative process is made to kill bills, not pass bills. Right, it's a filter. It's a filtering system, and so it's much easier to kill a bill than pass a bill. So my experience has been that most of the really extreme stuff gets laid by the wayside because the process itself is designed for compromise, right? So it's designed to sort of steer the bus to the middle of the road, so to speak. So that's so I haven't so knock on wood, I haven't had such a serious problem with a bill I'm working on that I've not been able to do it.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Jeff.
Peter, did you have a question?
Oh, I was just thinking that putting one of the interns to work on the bill could have led to sort of an ethical issue of a conflict of interest. Because, of course, several interns tend to have a very, well, Evans, I'm just going to say, has very strong culture. So it could lead to questions of whether even they will be trusted with it. So I think I was just saying it was a good idea to sort of leave the really controversial ones to the professionals.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have that view about Evans, but I can see what you're saying. We have a lot of Evans grads in our office, like a lot of in fact, a lot of the alumni from our internship program come back and work for us permanently. So we have quite a few of our current employees who are former legal interns and public affairs interns, and a lot of them are from Evans. I mean, I obviously don't hire exclusively from Evans. I also recruit from Evergreen and Seattle University, their programs as well. But a lot of our employees are Evans grads. We also have, I should probably put a plug in for our budget fellowship as well while I'm here. We also have a program for people who are interested in budgeting. This is a postgraduate fellowship, so this would be after you graduate. But we have a 1-year budget fellowship where we hire a temporary employee who works for us for a year and who is assigned a budget portfolio and works as a entry-level budget analyst in our office. And that has been a very fruitful source of employees for us. Most of the almost all of the budget fellows end up staying with us after their fellowship is done. So so I have not noticed any kind of bias from Evans students that interfere in their ability to perform their work in my office. In fact, I think that Evans is, obviously Evans is one of the best MPA programs in the country, and I found that reputation is well deserved.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for wasting your time with that point.
Don't apologize, and you're not wasting my time at all. I'm happy to talk about these sorts of things. Any other questions or comments? Any questions about legislative process? You guys gotta want to know where the bodies are buried down here in Olympia, right? So that's actually one of the important aspects of my job also, is that we're a confidential service. So any work we do for individual legislators, we keep confidential. And that's if you can imagine, being in a nonpartisan position, that's very important. So I'm often working on a bill for one member. That member introduces that bill, and then members try to amend that bill, and a lot of times those amendments are unfriendly amendments. So it's a very unique, for attorneys especially, it's a very unique job, because in a normal traditional legal practice, I would be conflicted out of working for both sides like that. But the nice thing about the legislature is that I get to work on both sides of the issue. And I guess personally, what I would say regarding some of the partisan questions, the questions about being nonpartisan, I would say that, I had very definitive political views going into this job. And I would say, though, that I disagree with the Democrats with equal frequency that I disagree with the Republicans. And personally, and this job has made me both more cynical about politics and also a lot more optimistic about politics. So cynical in the sense that I often see the sort of behind the scenes work that goes on, and how people talk about sausage making. So I see the sausage making of the legislative process firsthand. I see a lot of the compromises that get made and the reasons for those compromises. But on the other hand, I get to work with a lot of dedicated people. I was very cynical about politics before I started here, but the legislators are just regular people like you and me, and they signed up to do a very difficult job making really difficult decisions. If you think about it, all of the easy stuff is done already. So if the issue is easy, it's pretty much already been taken care of. And so the only things that are left are controversial, difficult things. So these are people who are just doing their best, trying to grapple with difficult issues. One of the great things about our state legislature, and I don't know about the feds, but on the state level, normal people, normal everyday people have a lot of access. So people can sign up and testify on bills, and anybody can sign up. And oftentimes I see a legislator's mind changed by somebody who testified at a hearing or somebody who made an appointment to go talk to them. So, you know, when I started here, I thought only people with money, only like rich lobbyists, you know, representing big interests would get in the door, and legislators would only listen to those people. But that has not been my experience. I've often experienced like some just normal everyday person who has some problem, who talks to their legislator, and their legislator agrees, and a bill ends up getting introduced and passing as a result. So that's a really inspiring part of working here as well. So even though you may have to work on bills that you disagree with, you are kind of also participating in this process, which is a lot more open and public than I had anticipated going into this job. So that's one of the nice things about my experience. Any other questions, Christine?
Hi, thank you for giving this presentation today. My question is, what pathways or backgrounds do people have coming in to work in your office other than coming in through the internship program?
That's a really good question. We hire people from all kinds of varied backgrounds. So we frequently hire people straight out of grad school. So we hire a lot of brand new attorneys and brand new MPAs. I was actually hired at this job straight out of law school. This is the only job I've ever had as a lawyer, actually. And we also do hire people with experience. So sometimes we're looking for subject matter experts. So we're looking for somebody with specific subject matter expertise. Mostly though, when we're hiring, I kind of feel like learning a subject matter, that's something that can be taught and learned. Learning the skills on how to do this job is something that can be taught and learned. So more I'm looking for a certain kind of person rather than a certain kind of background. And by kind of person, what I mean is somebody who is able to function in the nonpartisan environment and put their political beliefs aside, somebody who is intelligent and able and a good writer and a careful reader, and somebody who has kind of good analytical skills as demonstrated through their their writing samples, and we also provide kind of a test for for new staff to demonstrate their analytical abilities, so we do that as well. But the one thing that is can be a bit of a barrier to permanent hiring on my staff is political activity. So it's not an absolute barrier to being hired, and I'm actually looser with the interns than I am with permanent staff. But one thing that can be a bit of a barrier is partisan political activity. So for example, if we've had people who've applied to our office who have been candidates to be a legislator, or people who have worked, on campaigns. That's not an absolute bar to working for us, but it can be a barrier because, for example, if you were a sitting legislator and you saw that my office hired the campaign manager to your opponent in the last election, you would question that person's ability to do their job, right? So that's the only kind of job where I think it can be sort of a barrier to employment. But other than that, we're just looking for people who have, a variety of different backgrounds. In fact, I think that's one of the strengths of my office is that we don't have a cookie cutter background that we're looking for. That has led to a lot of diversity in terms of experience and educational attainment in my office, which has been very helpful to us over the years. Neil, did you have a question?
Yes, kind of two entirely separate questions. One, kind of talking about the specialization of kind of focus areas you can work on. How much of that is somewhat assigned, and how much of that is kind of flexible or something you can kind of request early on? And then separately, could you talk a bit about kind of where people end up maybe 3, 5, or 10 years down the line after this internship?
Absolutely. So regarding specialization, Let me talk about the intern program first. So the first thing that with the interns, I try to assign them a variety of bills around in a variety of areas. And if an intern has specified an interest in a particular area, I try to get them work in that area if I can. Sometimes there's not assignments appropriate for interns in that area, but if there are, I try to at least get them some experience working in that area. One of the nice things about the internship is that interns get a broad exposure to many subjects. We had one of our legal interns came in thinking that all she wanted to do is criminal law. That was her thing. That's why she went to law school. She got assigned a few bills on the labor committee, and it just ignited something in her, and now she's a labor attorney, right? So you never know, especially when you're a student, you never know where your career is gonna lead you. So I do try to give interns issues in their area that they like, but I also try to assign them other interests, other areas as well, because my experience has been there are interesting issues in every subject matter. Regarding the permanent employment, we're usually hiring for a particular committee. So we'll have a vacancy on the healthcare committee, for example. So we'll be hiring for somebody who's either has experience or interested working in healthcare issues. But as I mentioned before, there's opportunities to move around in my office. So even if that's not your thing, you kind of are maybe marginally interested in healthcare, and what you really want to do is civil rights and judiciary, or criminal justice and corrections, or environmental law, or something like that. There's always opportunities to move around to those different subjects. And then within the committees themselves, excuse me, I just spit. They have very broad subject matter portfolios. So we tend to specialize even on our committees. For example, on my committee, as I mentioned, I do mostly health professions and private insurance, but my committee also covers Medicaid, public health, and all kind hospital regulation. There's all kinds of subject matters. And that kind of subspecialization is done very informally. So as I mentioned, we have a very flat structure. So there's nobody who's your supervisor on that committee. So what we do is we collaborate with each other. My colleagues and I split up the issues. And on my committee anyway, we also overlap and cover each other's areas, so that no one of us gets hit particularly hard with workload. So when I started at this office, I had no interest in criminal law whatsoever. I just got assigned to that committee. And I had a very rewarding career on that committee, but then I decided I wanted to do something else. And a vacancy on the healthcare committee opened up, and I said I was interested, and they reassigned me. And I've been on this committee for 12 years now. So it's been it's really nice to be able to have that flexibility to switch around and find the niche in our office that really suits you. Any other questions or comments? Oh, I'm sorry. You had asked me where people end up after they leave. I forgot about that. Let me tell you where people end up with I hope that 5 or 10 years from starting in our office, that people are still at my office. That's always my hope, is that we can retain staffers. And as I mentioned, this is my 24th year in the office. I just finished my 25th session. And so we have a lot of people like me. I'm not the only one like that. There are a lot of people in my office who have been here a very, very long time. And so that's what we're hoping for. But I know that people's career paths lead them in other directions, and that's also fine with us. We want people to grow in their careers and have satisfying careers, even if it's not with us. Examples of what people do after us, and I'll focus on the MPA side of the shop. We have a lot of the governor's policy advisors right now are former OPR staff. The chief clerk of the House of Representatives is a former OPR staff. The there's a lot of agency budget directors who are former OPR staff, and agency policy directors who are former OPR staff. So I would say for MPA students, a lot of people who move on from my office end up moving on into leadership positions within state and local government. That's the most frequent career trajectory I've seen. But we have had MPA students go to the Gates Foundation, for example. So people go to do all kinds of things. One of the nice things about my office is that, as I mentioned, you get to work directly with legislators and stakeholders. So people in my office get a lot of exposure to decision makers in all facets of state government. And so our office gets, people recruit out of our office quite frequently. Obviously, that's not ideal for someone like me, but we also have a culture of wanting people to have satisfying careers. I think a lot of employers, might punish employees for looking outside their agency or be angry at people for leaving. We're never angry at people for leaving. We want people to have rewarding careers, and we know that sometimes that's with us and sometimes that's not. And so if our office ends up not being a good fit for somebody and they want to move on, we try to be as supportive as we can. We obviously don't want somebody to leave us during the middle of session or right before session, but other than that, we try to be as supportive as we can to people as they move forward in their careers. And a lot of times people come back. They'll move on to somewhere else and then realize that the grass wasn't quite as green as they thought and come back and work for us. So that's always nice as well.
It's really helpful. Thank you. Never angry, always disappointed. Got it.
Yeah, exactly. Melanie, did you have a comment?
Yes, question / comment.
Okay.
So our attendees in this space, it's a mixed bag of both first years and continuing students who are getting ready to graduate in June.
Yeah.
Could you speak more to like the recruitment period of this budget fellowship and when our graduating students might anticipate that information coming out?
Yes, I should also mention that for our public affairs program, internship program, one of our requirements is that you be an enrolled student for both parts. So if you're about to graduate, you would not be eligible for the internship program, but you would be eligible for our budget fellowship program, which I believe we usually recruit for that in the late spring, early summer is when we usually recruit for that. It can vary a little bit depending on the timing. We had a bit of a weird recruitment this last time, so our budget fellows started later than we normally would like. But usually during spring is when we start. Late spring is when we start hiring for the budget fellow.
Thank you. And then for our first year students in the space who are considering the internship, as the job description is posted in EvansJobs, also feel free to check the PDFs that are attached, because you're probably also wondering what's going to happen with your course sequence when you are in session. So that is just a note to double check that information too.
Yeah, I know it affects your capstone, how you do your capstone, but every intern that has from Evans who has participated has graduated on time. So it's definitely doable, and people have made it work. And most of I think all of the ones I'm aware of, the Evans students that I'm aware of, have had very positive experiences, and it was worth not doing a traditional capstone. So I encourage you to think of that not as a huge barrier to working with us. Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you very much for being such an engaged audience and listening to me prattle on and on today. I really appreciate that. And my contact information is in the job application materials. So if you have any questions you didn't get to ask today, feel free to reach out to me via email. I'd be happy to answer any questions that I can. During an active recruitment, if you're thinking about applying, I might be limited in what I can answer. I don't want to give somebody an unfair advantage, but outside of that, I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.